We are delighted today. We have two outstanding citizens of our city and of our state. We are really, really honored. As a sidebar, these gentlemen are very punctual. They arrived at 11 a.m. this morning. So Kathy and Jen had 20 minutes or so just to talk to them, just the four of them. She told me that they could tell her how to do just about anything, and she would be enthralled by listening to him. She said she had, I think she actually used the word sweet and kind. That's not the words I would use, but those were the words. But these are just great gentlemen. They've both been great public servants. Governor Martin was born in Winsboro, South Carolina, attended Davidson, became a professor of chemistry at Davidson, and was elected at age 31 to the county commission. After serving 8 or so years, he ran for the U.S. Congress and was elected in 1984 and served for 8 years. Excuse me. First of all, he left the county commission and served in Congress and then was elected governor and served for 2 terms. Delighted to have him. He's a great public servant. And Mr. Vinroot was our mayor. He's a East Mecklenburg graduate like I am, played basketball for Dean Smith. I was real involved in Richard's 2000 campaign, which was an unsuccessful campaign for governor. That's a race that we should have won, thought we had won, but we did not. But he would have been a great governor. He's been a great leader for our city and our state. So, gentlemen, we are honored to have you here. And just because of the status of you guys, we hired extra security with Sheriff Carmichael here to take care of you guys. So please help me welcome 2 great men.
Maybe I should bring my lunch up here while he's speaking.
I'll be brief. Well, first of all, I don't think anybody in my family would refer to me as a great man. My wife certainly would not. I am privileged to talk about a subject that both Governor Jim Martin and I have been talking about to some people across the state, and that one that I think is maybe the reason for most of the ills of our country's politics today, and I'll explain that shortly. But also, it's not isolated to America. It's a matter that, can you hear me all right? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you move up a little closer?
Yeah, okay, you do that. Thank you. It's a worldwide phenomenon. I mean, it's as natural, I suppose. Thank you, sir. This is not something that's isolated in America. It was mentioned by Chuck correctly that this all began in, I think, 1812 or so when Governor Gerry in Massachusetts, a Republican/Democrat, wanting to oust the Federalists, set up a new legislative map, the salamander that was referred to earlier, and succeeded in getting a legislature that more suited his way of thinking, but he lost the election as a consequence. That didn't just happen there. It happens all over the country, all over the world, in fact. They now call it in Texas gerrymandering because Governor Perry did the same thing, and they call it in California gerrymandering after the current governor who did the same thing. So we're not the first to do it, and it's something that I think has caused people in Congress particularly, which we're aware of, and people in legislatures to essentially dominate and get elected without having much in the way of elections. And then when they get there, there's really no need to talk to the other side because your only danger is getting beat in a primary back home, so why would you mess with the other party? I tell this story, I've told it several times. A congressman from down in Goldsboro was at my class reunion in Chapel Hill. He had been a congressman from 10 years, Democratic congressman. He was telling me about going back to an event in Washington where I gather, Jim, you have privileges in the dining room, and he went into the House dining room with a lot of the other folks who were back for this gathering. And he went and sat with a table of 8 or 10 people, maybe half of which were Republicans. And as he left the dining room, one of his former colleagues came up and said, "Why did you sit with those people? We don't have anything to do with those people." He said, "Well, they were my friends when I was here." And he said, "Well, that's all changed. We just don't even have anything to do with those people, and they don't have anything to do with us," which is sort of what's happened. Let me tick off a little bit about the effects of this. And I think when you have no negotiations and no meeting at the middle of many things, you don't have very good politics, and I think that's a lot of what afflicts American public policy today. These are just some statistics, and I won't be long with this, but there are 435 congressmen in America, and there are somewhere between 12 and 30 that are in meaningful November elections every 2 years. More than 400 are decided either in the primary itself or more likely on the day of the filing deadline when nobody files against them and they rest and go forward to elect their district. It's not just in the U.S. Congress, though. Let me tell you about North Carolina. We have, as many of you know, well, first of all, let's bring it down to Congress. In 2010, there were 7 Democratic congressmen, 6 Republicans in a state that was about 50-50, 51-49, still is today. As you know, in 2010, that was a landslide election nationally. It was in reaction probably to Obamacare, which was perceived as unpopular throughout the country. And Republicans took charge of our state legislature that year, even with maps that were not drawn to favor them. And when they got control of the mechanism, they did what the U.S. Constitution and our North Carolina Constitution permits them to do every 10 years, and that is redraw the lines in North Carolina politics. So in our Congress now from North Carolina, there are 10 Republicans and 3 Democrats, a roughly 50-50 state, as opposed to 7-6. And one of our Republican colleagues, Jim, said when they redrew the lines to go 10-3, they did the best they could. They were trying to go to 11-2. They just couldn't figure out how to do it. So we're stuck with 10-3. In our legislature, there are 120 House members. Roughly 1/2 of those legislators will not face anybody in November. They are already there. Another 1/3 will be winning by about 15% or more, and about 20 will be in real elections out of the 120 statewide, 1 or 2 of them right here in Mecklenburg County. Of the 50 senators, 20 are already elected without opposition. Another 20 will win by 15% or more in landslide elections, and there are 10 who are going to face real elections. Interesting sort of side note to all this, and this is the Republicans who know how to do it, and they have the computers and all the technology to do it very, very well. And we'll talk more about this in a few minutes, but the black vote has been dealt with in a way that, as you know, probably typically favored Democratic candidates. The Republicans have essentially isolated a number of black voters throughout the state so that they're now the high watermark of black elected officials in the state. There are in the state legislature 23 out of 120 House members are African American, 10 out of 50 senators are African American, and as you know, 2 out of our 13 U.S. congressmen and women are African American. So a lot of the people that are probably not complaining as much as the folks who recently filed a lawsuit by Democratic former elected officials all over the state, 13 I think of them, are mostly white Democrats complaining about what is going on in North Carolina. They have essentially, the Republicans, used the black voters to isolate them in districts that have taken advantage of where they live. And if you look, and I'll stop in about a minute and let Jim talk. If you look at our congressional map, I doubt you can see this now, but this is a color-coded map of the current districts. The 3 Democratic districts are this little orange block down here, which is Mecklenburg County. That is Mrs. Adams. She lives in Greensboro, but has moved to Charlotte. Okay, moved to Charlotte. She was from Greensboro. She was the congresswoman that was in the district that was the snake that went from roughly Mecklenburg to Durham. That has been replaced by the block that is now essentially Mecklenburg County. I can't recall whether she faces opposition. I think she does, but it's such a Democratic district that I think that's going to be a tough one for Republicans to take.
She's actually running against an African American.
I know that. The other Democratic 2 districts are this yellow area up in northeastern North Carolina. That is Congressman Buttersworth. He had a pretty good election last time. He won by 60%. It was something like 80-20. So that one is clearly one he will be reelected in. I doubt there's anybody running against him that has any sense, if they are. And then finally, there is Charles Price's district, which is essentially a Raleigh to Durham and Chapel Hill version of the Mecklenburg County that Mrs. Adams represents.
David Price.
David Price, thank you. The rest of the state has been carefully gerrymandered so that there really are no opposition. The two congressmen, one from down in the Wilmington area, who represented that district for probably 15 or 20 years, gave up when he saw what they had done to him, and the congressman, the former football player, Democrat up in the Asheville area, gave up and didn't run because of what they had done to him. Now, as good as North Carolina has been at it, there are other states that do it even better. Pennsylvania is a 51-49 Democratic state, but those people up there are real pros. I think there are 13 Republican congressmen and 5 Democrats. They really know how to do it and do it well, even without a majority of the state voters. The law has evolved, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes, but to say the least, we got a problem when in America, when we basically talk about having a democracy, there are very few people running in any elections, either in this state or in this nation, that are part of any real democratic process. They're in a partisan primary process, and they get there by being either far right or far left, and their only danger, frankly, is not being far right enough or far left enough. And the last thing they should do to get reelected is go to Washington or Raleigh and engage in some negotiation or compromise with the other party, because when they get back, there'll be somebody to their left or right who is right ready to take them out for their failure to adhere the party line. That's the nature of the problem. We've had an evolution of litigation over all of this. In the mid-'80s, as you know, there was a lawsuit that reached the U.S. Supreme Court that basically said, and this all follows the Voting Rights Act that came in 1964, that basically determined that much of the South in particular, and 40 out of North Carolina's 100 counties, were counties in which there needed to be pre-clearance of any laws that related to elections in those counties. There also were lawsuits that reached the Supreme Court that basically said that African American black voters were being underrepresented in Congress. They were. And that there were in this state, no African American congressmen because of the way the lines had been drawn before by the Democratic Party in control. And those lines were redrawn that resulted in the 12th district that we talk about, and that is really, when you talk about gerrymandering, if you go to Wikipedia or anything and want to see what gerrymandering is like, the first picture in there is the 12th district. It is the snake that ran from Charlotte to Durham, and that is the prime example of what is now considered effective gerrymandering. Well, those lawsuits have all evolved through the courts. They've come up with principles that tell you what you can and can't do with the use of the black voter. You can't pack them all into one area. You've got to have, I think the phrase is that they are narrowly tailored to undo the remnants of discrimination. You must, in fact, do certain things that comply, and the litigation goes on and on and on and on. I mean, there have been lawsuits in the federal courts since the mid-'90s and before that over not just the 12th district, but much of North Carolina. There are 2 or 3 lawsuits still pending in North Carolina over our legislative districts, over our congressional districts. The one I just mentioned is the one that really is sort of the high water mark, because the most recent lawsuit that's been filed, as I mentioned, the 13 representatives from across the state are challenging the principle of gerrymandering. And that principle basically is that it's okay to gerrymander for political and partisan purposes. You can't do it on racial grounds, and you must be careful how you use the blocking of black voters. But you indeed, alive and well is the idea that you can gerrymander to protect your partisan friends. You can gerrymander to protect candidates of your party who want to be elected officials. You can do all the things that you want to do in the name of, quote, politics. That was the law that evolved out of the original challenges to gerrymandering, and it's still alive and well. Now, this case that's now started and pending through the federal courts will challenge that very principle. But I'll be very surprised if that one succeeds, because that's been sort of the saving grace. And in fact, our legislators, when they redid the congressional lines that ended up with these districts bragged about doing it because, as I said, they did it as to try to get at least 10 out of 13. If they had been able to, they would have liked to have gotten 11 or 12 out of 13. They just weren't good enough in redrawing the lines for political purposes. Now, that's the problem. The question is, what do we do about it? And that's when I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jim Martin, who will tell you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. What are we going to do about it? Indeed. And I, too, will be brief no matter how long it takes. Just thought I should make that promise right at the beginning. Back in 1960, when Dottie and I came back from graduate school I had a teaching assignment at Davidson, she registered Democrat just as our parents were all and families were all Democrats, because just about everybody in the South was Democrat. You were told you had to register Democrat or else your vote wouldn't count in the primary. As Richard has outlined, today your vote doesn't count in the primary no matter which district you're in if you're in the minority. But I registered Republican not for ideological reasons. Back then, the very few of you who go back 56 years will remember that back then most Southern Democrats were conservative. Most Southern conservatives were Democrats. They ran things, and they were in charge. And I was simply a protest that I was not going to be a part of that. I thought that handicapped the entire Southeast, not just the Carolinas, but the entire Southeast. And so if all I could do was protest by registering as Republican, I'd do it. I'd waste my vote in the primaries and see where that led. Now, if you have had a chance or get an opportunity to buy a copy of my biography written by John Hood, I put in that plug because it didn't cost me a cent. And I have to help him a little bit to make up for his investment in that. It's called Catalyst, nice chemical term. The Rise of Republicans in North Carolina, or Jim Martin and the Rise of Republicans in North Carolina. The first chapter, you'll see a strategy session that was conducted at Blackberry Farms, just over the line in Tennessee, with my good friend Lamar Alexander and the late Carroll Campbell, Newt Gingrich. Trent Lott was supposed to be there, but something came up.
Was Lee Atwater part of that?
No, Lee was not in on that. John Sununu was. And we cooked up a strategy, which was mainly to get conservative Democrats to register Republicans so we could have a base to draw on for support and for contributions and for candidates, but mostly because the problem we were facing was that we could elect occasionally a Republican president, governor, senator, a couple of members of Congress, but down the ballot, it was hard to elect Republican sheriffs or state legislators or county commissioners, except in a few little outcroppings. And the reason was that people knew what the candidates at the top of the ticket were for. They didn't know what the candidates down ballot stood for, and so they didn't know their names. They'd just go revert to the straight ticket, either marking it on the ballot or pulling that lever on the machine to get all the Democrats in. So we couldn't elect any judges. Not a single Superior Court or Supreme Court or Court of Appeals Republican had been elected in about 100 years. I could appoint them, and then they'd be defeated at the next election. So that's some of my background. Somebody would say, somebody could argue that maybe we overdid it all across the South. And yet I could say in North Carolina that Republicans are not the majority party. They've done well in the polls. The current General Assembly, majority of Republicans, got a majority initially running in gerrymandered districts that finally caught up with the Democrats, which I'll get back to in just a moment. So what do we do about it? First you have to start thinking about what would be an appropriate reform. How do you get politics out of redistricting? And I think the answer is you can't. Politics is going to be in there. But how do you expose it and neutralize it as much as you can? And a few states have tried it with some mixed results. We need to learn from what they did right, what they did wrong. I think one thing you have to insist on is somehow defining what compact means and say that the districts have to be reasonably compact. That means they have to be cohesive. You can't run down the middle stripe of the highway to catch up with voters of the other party to pack them in. Because you see, the key to gerrymandering is you want the other party, the minority, to have districts that are extremely safe, like 80-20, and your candidates to be able to settle for 60-40, and that way you get more than your share. But if you make them compact, it sort of intrudes into that. It sort of makes them somewhat more competitive, which is really the ideal. You don't allow any factor in the design of the districts to take into account politics, partisan registration, race, any of the issues that could define support groups. You stick with compactness and cohesiveness. I would say somehow you define that the cross-section of a district should exceed 2 miles, 5 miles, something of that sort, so you don't get these narrow, wasp-waisted districts designed. You shouldn't take into account voting patterns, because that's another way. But ultimately, it's going to be voted on by the General Assembly, and the majority party has to approve it. When I was governor, of course, I had majorities of Democrats in both the House and Senate, and in those days, every Republican in the General Assembly was in favor of reforming redistricting. Every one. To get rid of gerrymandering, because they had endured it for almost a century, even though they finally won in that. And when they did and got a majority, they suddenly discovered the virtues of gerrymandering. Not just to preserve a majority, but supermajority, so you can override any governor's veto. Now, there's some other elements you could include and you could think of for what would constitute a proper reform. I think one would be that you have, you're not going to have a totally independent staff, but you have to have a bipartisan staff so that they can spy on one another, and have them prepare and submit 2 or 3 different maps for the General Assembly to approve. But before they submit it, it first has to be submitted to a commission that would be established that would be both bipartisan and have a lot of nonpartisan members. Somehow you got to find people whose reputation is so high that they wouldn't risk it by overlooking mischief in the design process. I even think you should have a couple of newspaper editors on there. If you could find one Republican, then you could probably do that. You can help me with that, Taylor. Well, maybe get 3 if you can find an unaffiliated. Yeah. It's in the eye of the beholder, I expect, but that's another. So the things like that you can spell out. Now that's a pretty complicated constitutional amendment to put all that in there, but somehow it has to be designed. But then how do you get the majority to approve it if they've got it the way they want it? So Richard and I came up with an idea. We talked with Jane Penske and with Bob Phillips and with others. And the plan that we have is one that is designed as a pragmatic feature to get it passed. How do you get something like that passed? Well, first you take out the risk to the incumbents by saying that it will take effect after the next redistricting, maybe after 2 more redistricting. My friend Mr. Batten would have fun with that because that favors the party in power for a couple more decades. But the Republicans would say in return, yeah, but we had it done to us for a century. We'll at least get a couple shots. And they'll mean that. And how do you do that? Well, you start the process. And we've discussed this with a few legislators. I only identify that we did speak with the Senate leadership because there's more of a top-down culture in the state Senate. And they gave us a polite hearing. I haven't seen any bill submitted yet, but we'll see how that works. This is not something that's going to go overnight. But we suggested to them that if they could start the process while they had these big majorities, so that you say that it's locked in so that you're eventually going to have a public referendum on amending the Constitution. And before that, you have steps. It'll take a little time, and that would be you appoint a commission that would last only until it had drafted what the Constitution is going to say, what the constitutional amendment would say. Submit that to the legislature for an up or down vote. And then it would take effect after the next redistricting, after the next census. And our argument was, you probably don't want to be in office that long. A lot of heads nodding. And you don't know, if you set it up, you protect the successors who may be from the other party. When they get back in, they'll be rediscovering the virtues of gerrymandering. And so that's it. And we also made the point that while you feel safe with these gerrymandered districts, remember that you first gained a majority running in gerrymandered districts that were as hard against you as the Democrats could make it. And that leads me to believe that at some point, maybe this year, maybe not, but some point in the not too distant future, there'll be enough errors that will create issues and will overturn it. And you better start dealing with this reform now while you have a chance. So I hope that takes hold. But there's another side to this. Again, it takes a little time, but I would say this is your responsibility to reach out and get your friends all across the state to reach out to every candidate for the General Assembly this year, 2 years from now, 4 years from now, and start pinning them down on whether they would support redistricting reform of some kind. You can't spell out all the details, but you've got to get them committed to doing it. I'll give an illustration of how that has happened. When I was governor, I didn't have the veto. I was the only governor in America that didn't have the veto. Governor of South Carolina, Governor of Georgia had the veto. Governor of Alabama had the veto. The governor of American Samoa had the veto, but not North Carolina. And most people felt embarrassed about that, and they also felt that good government would be served by having the governor get the veto. And so I started making it a campaign issue right away in the by-year election in 1986, again in 88. I had one other cause that I worked the same way, and that was to try to get some Republican judges elected. I could get them appointed, but then they'd lose in the election because nobody knew who they were, what they stood for, what their principles were. Because of the canon of judicial ethics, they couldn't really campaign about what they believed, but I could. So I'd go around the state telling them about what the Republican candidates for judge stood for, and if any one of them wanted to deny it, he or she was free to do it. They didn't. So we were able to plant that issue of conservative interpretations of the law, and that happened to work. It worked so well that we were sweeping the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals, and the Superior Court judges. And so the Democrat General Assembly then decided that that had gone on long enough, and they changed it to nonpartisan elections. And now you see it's coming back, I think, for the Court of Appeals, just to see how that works. But you need to ask them to take a stand on that. You'll find that most of them will find that pretty easy to do, but once you get them locked in, they feel safe in their district, they don't want to be there forever, but once you get them locked in, it begins to build up to where we achieve success with the veto. I was able to get it through the Senate, the constitutional amendment for a veto. In the House, it was a little more difficult. I was approached by Billy Watkins right after the 20 Democrats joined with the Republicans to overthrow Liston Ramsey, and Billy Watkins was his lieutenant. And he came to me and said, "Governor, if you'll get rid of this movement, we'll get you the veto." And I said, "All I got to do is betray my friends and I can have the veto." He said, "Yeah, we can do that for you." Well, I really didn't believe he could, but we got it through the Senate, couldn't get it through the House. And then when Governor Hunt got back in office, see, I was the bologna between his two slices of bread, or the beef, if I'm in a Republican audience, I'd explain it that way. But then he was finally able to get it, and it was because we built up pressure in the campaign, and you can build up pressure. So that's where we stand, and that's where we're going to stand. We'll keep working on that and hope we'll have your support. Thank you so very much. You may have some questions. Yes, Chuck.
What percent majority does it take for is it 3/4 majority or 2/3 majority of the Senate and House to approve an amendment, and then it has to go before the voters and requires a certain percentage? Is that correct?
And can we repeat the question so that Jerry can ask you?
Yeah, he was asking in the North Carolina Constitution what percentage of the General Assembly is required, and then in the referendum, it's 2/3 in the General Assembly, a majority in the referendum.
I think a referendum would have have an opportunity to be more successful than getting it through the current.
Well,
Yeah.
let's just test that. How many of you favor some sort of redistricting process that would avoid Jeremy, just to see what you think? You're not bound by it. Just what do you think? How many think it's a really bad idea? That's pretty typical. Whenever I ask people, it's almost, I think that they've done some polling, it's 67, 70% of North Carolinians think we ought
63
to
to 7.
63, what's even worse than 63 to 7, the other 20 or 30% don't know what they're being asked, I suppose.
Their eyes glaze over.
Yeah.
Jane, is that?
But it's a very popular idea with people like us outside the legislature, and it's very popular with people in the minority in the legislature of both parties, depending on when they're in the minority. They have this miraculous conversion when they become majority members, and they're all of a sudden opposed to it. I'm literally the people who are now in control of the process who aren't interested in doing it were bill filers in support of this for their first 10 or 15 years in the legislature. They're both terribly hypocritical about it. And I'm a little bit sympathetic to I've had one of the prominent legislators from Mecklenburg County say to me when I first got involved in this with Jim, "Why are you guys doing this? We got control now, let's keep it." I said, "Well, why don't we do the right thing?" And he said, "Well, let's do the right thing in about 20 or 25 years. Let's go ahead and enjoy it." And so,
Bingo.
frankly, Jim and I are onto that. We're not asking them to do it to themselves now. We're asking them to put
Because they won't.
they won't. To put a time bomb, if you will, it goes off in about 20 or 25 years, but we get to draw the process now the way we think it ought to be. And frankly, we Republicans would get credit for doing the right thing, even though we're not going to let it happen to anybody around here that's alive and well today, 20 or 25 years from now. But it is the right thing to do, and it can't be. There are 21, I think, states in America who have now done that. There are other nations who are doing that, and there must be 30 or 40 countries where this is a problem, not just America. And in fact, it was a problem in America when my history may not be quite accurate on this, but James Madison was of the out party with Patrick Henry, and I forget who was who. Madison, as I recall, was a Federalist. Patrick Henry and his ilk did not want James Madison to go to Congress. And so they gerrymandered the part of Virginia where James Madison was from to keep him from going to Congress. Well, he won anyway. He's one of the great fathers of our country. But this has been much a part of American history as mom and apple pie, I suppose. And it's natural that we do this. And there's a saying that we've got it now set up so that the politicians are selecting their voters as opposed to the voters selecting their elected politicians, just the reverse. And when you look at those numbers I cited in the beginning in North Carolina, I mean, in this 10 or so county area around Mecklenburg County, I promise you, there are not more than about 4 or 5 real elections this November. Most everybody else they know where they're going, they know what happened to them. It happened when they decided not to challenge somebody at the end of the filing period primarily. And you don't get out of that real negotiation and I think quality leadership of the sort that you certainly have with Jim Martin in Congress, and I think you certainly should have in communities that want to do their best.
There was a test case bill that passed the House, I think something like 88 to 27 for nonpartisan redistricting. The problem with that is they probably knew the Senate would never go along with it, and so they were safe.
Right. Eric.
But we keep pushing, and those kind of things can build.
Well, thank you so much for doing this. I totally agree with what you're doing, and Paul, I just like to speed the process up, as I'm sure you would too, but I think this is just one element of the winner-take-all disease that's hurting our democracy. There's other things that are going on. The extremely partisan media, television channels, that sort of thing. Infusion of large amounts of cash that drown out the voice of the common man, the common woman. Do you have any ideas on how to deal with some of those other winner-take-all issues that are damaging our democracy today?
You mean get a majority to vote against themselves?
Well, it's to the point that the individual voter's voice is being drowned out. One way is by gerrymandered districts, other ways is large amounts of cash.
It'd be hard for me to say that voices are being drowned out in this society. You know, people, there are two things that have led to redistricting being so feral. And one is that you've got computers to assist you in designing them as brutally as you want to. The other is the Supreme Court, for the highest of motives, decided that every congressional district and therefore every legislative district had to have the same number of voters. Now they're trying to decide whether it's residents rather than voters, but the same number of voters as every other district in the same state. Before that, I had 3 counties, Mecklenburg, Ardell, that's how we pronounce that, and Lincoln County, and the whole counties. They didn't divide counties. After that, they had to split Yadkin in order to let me have the same number as everybody else. And so they gave me, of course, the most Republican side of Yadkin, which is like money in the bank. But that makes it possible for legislatures to create things like that snake district that ran over to Greensboro and Durham because of that decision. Now, you can't go back on that, but you can at least put into the North Carolina Constitution that they'll be compact and cohesive and minimize, that's another thing you can say, is to limit the number of counties that can be divided. With 100 counties and 13 congressional districts, for example, you might say that no more than 13 counties can be divided. If you look at the map that the Republican General Assembly adopted after the snake district, which the Democrats had originally created with Republican support, if you look at the map that was adopted after that, it only splits 13 counties. So they could meet that challenge very easily. Still, I mean, they dealt with the rest to get the best deal they could. But you're going to have a couple of competitive districts there. I think my friend Robert Pittenger, has a competitive district now, and probably the Western district will be competitive. You got to be careful how they count votes over in Madison County. Watch them close. Yes.
But let me take a crack at what you just said. I'm not sure I agree with you, Eric. There's a lot of consternation about what's the decision, United Citizens or Citizens United, which unleashed corporate and private money into elections. I think I heard this correctly, and don't hold me to it, but I'm not far off, I think. There's probably more money spent on Valentine's Day in America, on Valentine's, than there will be in this American election in November. We honestly don't spend a lot of money on our elections compared to a lot of other things we do in American life. And I think you're going to be hard-pressed to put that genie back in the bottle. Money is going to flow in elections, and we're probably going to all see that. And I don't know whether that's good or bad. Television is the reason it's now spent in such great gobs. Before, I'm sure Taylor and others would say we ought to do away with television, then we'd spend it on newspaper ads. But that's where it's all going, into TV and communications. And now you may not even need TV. If you're Donald Trump at 3 a.m, I guess you can send out some sort of message to 13 or 14 million people, and it all is getting blurred by all the communication. So I'm not real sure that money is the real evil here. I mean, I think what we really have, to get further into your question, is we just have a sort of a limbo contest for president. I mean, how low can we get? And we have a lot of things going on in American life that mirror American television and American movies we go see and the behavior of Americans. I asked my wife the other day, who is Kim Kardashian and what is her talent? She says she has no talent. She's Kim Kardashian. It doesn't matter in America, apparently. If you're famous, you're famous, and that's enough. And that's not the best in the best interest of good government and good leadership. But that's where we are.
Look, gerrymandering polarizes the districts, but it's worse than that. And I'm going to put a burden on you moderates. because in North Carolina, most moderates have pulled out of both parties. And what does that do but push the parties further apart,
Yeah.
where they don't have to talk to each other. They don't have to cut deals with each other because they can get nominated in their district, and then they'll get elected in their district. You have a chance, and then you, Mr. Gallis.
Oh, no, let him go first. I mean,
Chivalry is with us.
I completely agree with what you just said, and as I'm a registered Democrat, because my family's been here forever, but I voted for both of you guys every time I had an opportunity.
Thank you.
I just read an article, I think in the Observer Online, where you said in a blurb about this big that Garrett Merlin or Merlin Garrett or whatever his name
Merrick Garland, Circuit Court Judge.
is probably the best option than anything we're going to get from whoever the next president is. Is there
More centrist, and we need that on Supreme Court right now. You've got your partisan blocks.
Right. So is there any chance, given the fact now that it appears we've got a fight between Paul Ryan and Donald Trump, is there a remote possibility that the legislature, the Congress will go ahead and vote to have him appointed to the Supreme Court as sort of a
You know,
scrutiny to everybody?
I think that is the Senate district, just the Senate would vote on confirmation. That they could say, well, if Secretary Clinton is elected president, then we'll have a rump session and approve that appointment. The problem with that is President Obama could withdraw that appointment and leave it over for for his successor. And so that would backfire on them. They should have done it when they had a chance.
Yeah.
And there are going to be two more Supreme Court appointees, very likely. I mean, the what is it in insurance? Anyway, the statistical chances are probably, yeah. Actuarial tables, yeah.
No, I was going.
your conversation has sort of brought back some deja vu from a forum that the Observer held. And I remember it was Senator Olympia Snow being interviewed by Erskine Bowles on a similar situation about partisanship and the problem with redistricting. And as I was leaving, I remember the thought that I want to put to you all, which is I've never heard a candidate for office or anyone running for re-election say, I am running for Congress because I want to stop gerrymandering. So it's never been an outside-in issue. It's always been inside-out. And my parenthetical to that, my question to you is, it only seems like the only force from the outside that can collectively organize around this issue are groups like Bob Phillips' group, which are rather nonpartisan in nature, but the business community. Why wouldn't the business community, the national chambers, the local chambers, what type of traction could we get, or could you get on these issues if there is anything?
You could,
I
but
don't see how you could ever really get enough consumer interest in an issue that is such inside baseball, if you will.
well, but businesses are not going to be opposed to redistricting reform, and so they're not going to be a problem. You get individual voters to go and do it, and that's you guys and people that you know all across the state. But it's not members of Congress. It's members of the General Assembly, candidates for the General Assembly, because Congress doesn't have anything to do with redistricting, except to say, please give me a safe district where I live.
Bob, what's your thought on that?
I couldn't have scripted that. I was going to say I couldn't have scripted that question better because we have always tried to get the business community more engaged on this. And there's a little bit of what we've heard risk averse. Obviously, the business community has an agenda before the legislature, and they're going to be shy to stick their neck out on this issue. However, we have had some success. We do actually have something called North Carolinians for Accountability, and you can find it online. And in Raleigh last week, we actually had more than 50 business people stand up and say we do want to have an end to gerrymandering. And so we are beginning to make that pitch. And my hope is that certainly listening to these two prominent and wise folks, leaders here, that more business people will heed the call. We're trying to push that. We think we have an excellent opportunity in this current climate. So my only pitch would be please look at the North Carolinians for Accountability site, and if you have an interest, sign up, because if you're a business person, your voice really does matter.
I should note that both candidates for governor support what we're talking about. That's not an issue with either Pat or Roy, and that's they're both to be complimented for believing in that. Now, whether each of them, if he was a legislator in the majority or minority party, would see it the same way once he was in the majority, I don't know. But
Mr. Gallo's next, then you.
Can you speak about the mechanics of this? Is this an act of the legislature that could be overturned before it ever takes effect? How do you protect the action?
You build up political support for it, and if it's good enough to get your approval through the General Assembly, it'll probably stick. Now, you could have an intervening election just before it's put in motion, that you change power. But if you start building up support in the minority party now, if and when it ever gets a majority again, you will have built up commitments to do that.
But the answer to your question,
North Carolina doesn't do that except if authorized by the General Assembly.
the technical answer to your question is what we're asking the legislature to do is not just adopt a law to do it, but adopt a law that puts it to a statewide referendum
Or
as a constitutional amendment. If it weren't going to be in the Constitution, it would not be worth doing for the very reason your question poses, because the next majority could undo it in a heartbeat. We need the people of North Carolina who favor this to get the chance to say we want it. If they ever do, they will say that. And that's probably one of the reasons the gatekeepers in the legislature who are in power now, who were for it before, are so far not opening that gate. And incidentally, there are former Democratic leaders, former mayor of Raleigh, former Governor Hunt, and others who agree with us, but Jim's and my view is, and we think we're right, it's best that we do this alone. We don't want our message from two Republicans to be clouded by the fact that there's some Democrats who think it's a good idea, because the legislative Republican leadership will say, well, of course they're for it. But where were they when they were in the majority? They weren't for it, they weren't talking. They may have said it, but they sure weren't pushing for it. So it is right that we, as Republicans, push hard for it to our people who are in power, in hopes that they will see the wisdom of doing so down the road.
Back over here, second table back, yes.
I'm Ingram Walters from Union County. Quick question for both you guys. Thanks for being here. In a paragraph or less, what is the proper role of government?
To be by the people, of the people, by the people, and for the people.
No, well, it depends on what party you're in, I suppose. I'd say do as little damage as possible while you're there, and leave us alone is sort of the Republican philosophy. We want governments to do things we can't do for ourselves. That's why we have governments that have police forces and armies. We want governments to create for us in this city water and sewer systems that work. We don't necessarily want them to run our education system, but we want an education system of some sort, and we want all manner of things that help us educate our people. But beyond those several things, protect us, let us get from one place to the other, let us have safe water, and educate our kids. There's not a whole lot else that I really want my government to do for me. I want them to leave me alone. But that's not obviously a view from everybody in this room. I know that. Yeah.
Yes.
Up until recently, or I'm not sure how far back it goes, but there was a lot of southern states, election district setting had to be approved by, it was federal oversight.
Department of Justice.
That's the Voting Rights Act of 1964's mandate that requires the 13 southern states and 40 of North Carolina's 100 counties to essentially go to the Justice Department whenever they do anything relating to voting. And that's still a requirement. Now, most recently, I want to say in the last Congress, and I take that back, it may have been the Supreme Court that actually said it's outlived its usefulness. You've got to go back and prove again that they're doing bad things and have another Voting Rights Act if you want to keep us in the picture of pre-clearing your elections. That's how this 12th district, incidentally, all these things had to go to the legislature, and our own legislators now are sort of proud of the fact that the districts that they designed and these got pre-cleared. But about the time they got pre-cleared, the Supreme Court spoke and said no more requirement of that.
And then we need a question from the back. You guys, perk up back there. Wake up. Go ahead, Chuck. No, I don't see any hands yet. You go ahead.
How big a problem is the voter fraud, the basis of the voter ID requirement that our legislature came up with?
Voter fraud has always been a big problem, not only in North Carolina, but all across the country, because so much is at stake. When I was governor, the U.S. attorney for the western part of the state prosecuted and got convictions of the two candidates, Democrat and Republican, for sheriff, for vote buying. And he had 23 or so, 25 witnesses who testified that their votes had been bought in that campaign. The Democrat just happened to buy more than the Republican did in that case, so he was elected. Well, because of that, the state attorney in that same area in Madison County decided he would prosecute those who had sold their vote, because that was a violation of law. They had been given immunity by the U.S. attorney, but he could only apply that for federal courts, and so the state district attorney brought suit against and got convictions for those who had sold their vote to send a message that nobody else should testify against his good sheriffs in other areas of the state. So what I did was pardon all of those 25 to send a message that you do your best to try to help us get good government, and we're going to protect you.
Let me. I want to answer that at the same time. I don't know. I don't know the numbers, but I can tell you that in my lifetime, it has been a problem. I mean, Landslide Lyndon was elected to the U.S. Senate because of voter fraud in Texas. Jack Kennedy jokingly remarked after he won the election, the very close election in 1960, that he won a close election because his father just refused to buy a landslide. And that was referring most specifically to Illinois, where voter fraud has gone on for years. It does go on. I suspect it's at the margins. I don't think it's probably enough to justify on the face of it voter ID. But voter ID is something that's sort of, it's all party oriented. The Democrats don't want voter ID because they think it more afflicts poor and African American voters, and it's harder to come by. I don't quite buy that. You can't go anywhere without all the things you carry, anybody, Social Security card, you name it. So I don't think it's all that hard. But it's clearly about Republicans trying to curtail that vote. I mean, I think there's no secret about that. And how many hours you vote and how many days you vote for the election. Heck, when the Republicans took control and limited the number of days that we could vote before the election, the vote still went up. But there's no doubt that there's some gaming going on both sides. And there's no doubt that the folks who don't want voter ID are more interested in Democratic voters voting without regard to whether they can identify themselves or not. But you'd be hard pressed probably today to say all these things are justified. But across the country, I mean, decisions, New York has less voting days than we do, always have. And I don't hear anybody up there crying about somehow New York has disfranchised all of its people. By the way, New York is one of the places where, because of their rules, one of the great voting districts there is they divide up, the districts by virtue of the U.S. Constitution on the number of people, and the state constitution mirrors that. In New York, one of the districts is full of prisoners, none of whom vote. It's a very small group of voters, but the population that counts in New York under their constitution includes people who are incarcerated. So there are lots of ways to gerrymander and do it effectively. Back to our subject.
Some would say there's been no violation of the right to vote for lack of ID, but you don't know that for lack of ID. The precinct workers do not know everybody in their district. If somebody comes in and says, and they find out that Chuck Hood has moved out of the state, but is still on the roll book, they can go and say, I'm Chuck Hood, and probably get away with it. Now, there's a risk, but people take risks in politics, and they always have. There'll be some. You'll have people who come in from other states to work here in the campaign, and they could very easily find out who in certain precincts no longer lives there and come in and vote, and nobody would know the difference. And I believe it happens. Edwin Peacock's father and I and a couple others raised a little bit of money, and I wish the Charlotte Observer would do this, but if they report what I'm going to tell you, they probably won't be able to do it. But we sent first-class postcards, Merry Christmas, Shop Buy American, something like that, first class, to people who had actually voted in 4 precincts. That's all we could afford to do. And we got back something like 5% on a couple of precincts that didn't live there at the time because the cards came back to us. That's not overwhelming, but it's significant, and maybe they were all honest. Maybe they all had reasons. The time to do it, though, would be just before the election, so you can check it. I think there is mischief going on. I remember there were stories about students, college students, who are allowed to vote either in their own state of their family residence or in the state where they go to school. But what's to stop them from voting in both places if you don't have a correlation of records? And North Carolina was able to establish with a couple of states that there were a number of students who were voting both places. Do people cheat? Yes, they do.
One more, John.
I'd like you to address the issue of term limits versus the strategy you're using to change the makeup of legislatures. Can you speak to that?
I'm all for that. I think that's a great idea. And I also, I use this example. I think when the country was established and these farmers and lawyers and various people went off to the U.S. Congress for a short time each year to do the things they do to set policy, they'd go back to their farms and go back and do the things they do. That's no longer the case. The folks who go to Washington are bound to stay there. I mean, there are people running. Young Evan Bayh is running for the Senate in Indiana, which he left a few years ago, and one of the campaign ads against him is that he hadn't lived there in so long. He's been in Washington even after he quit serving in the Senate. But that's the rule. I mean, these folks never leave that place, and they are bound to be public officials on the public tab for the rest of their lives, pretty much. And when they leave the Congress, they go to work in lobbying firms and the whole bit. And I think that's part of what's wrong in America, too. These are no longer citizen legislators in the form that they began to be. They are professionals. And indeed, even in our legislature, I mean, to serve in our legislature, you better be willing to give up whatever you do and go up there for 6 or more months and live there for very little pay. It's hardly a representative group of people, frankly, because I guarantee there's not maybe anybody in this room who could afford to do that or would be willing to do that. So we're getting sort of what we deserve, I suppose, in these career people who make decisions for us.
You remember when Newt Gingrich led the movement that led to the first Republican House of Representatives in some 50 years or so? They had a Compact for America, and one of the elements of that was that they would have a vote. They couldn't promise how it would turn out, but they said, we will have a vote on limited terms for members of the House. And it was defeated. But they got a vote. They kept their promise.
What do you think, people? Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you, sir.
Addressing the issue of restricting the number of days of voting and that type of thing, our speaker, Michael Steele, on Friday, many of you heard him say one solution would be to make the voting day a national holiday. And if that wouldn't work, then have elections to take place on a Saturday, Sunday, rather than a Tuesday, to give more people the opportunity to get out to vote. Folks, I think we got 2 really, really fine, dedicated men that are leading this effort, and I'm just really honored and proud that they took the time to come visit with us. And I would challenge all of us to do what we were asked to do. If you believe that reform is the right thing to do, then we should do what he asked us to do. They asked us to write our congressmen and tell them just that.
No, state legislative candidates.
My mistake. Our state legislative candidates. So I encourage you
That's why we're here.
to all do that. So once again, thank you guys for coming today, and I'm sure that the governor and the mayor will stick around and answer a few questions if you want to come up and visit. So thanks again for coming.